Hello and welcome to this session of the conference. My name is Keith Frankish and I shall be presenting my paper, Qualia, the Real Thing. It's a pleasure to contribute to this online conference, and I'd like to begin by thanking Richard Brown for all his work in arranging it. Okay, let's begin. People disagree about whether consciousness can be explained in physical terms. Now, disagreement about the explanation of something presupposes agreement about what it is that needs explaining, the explanandum. That is, it's assumed that we can define the explanandum for a theory of consciousness in a neutral way that's acceptable to both physicalists and non-physicalists. I'm going to argue that this assumption is false, or at least highly suspect. This may be an uncomfortable conclusion, but I think it's one we need to face. Note that what I'm talking about here is consciousness in the phenomenal sense. There are, of course, many well-established distinctions among kinds of consciousness, between creature consciousness and mental state consciousness, transitive consciousness and intransitive consciousness, access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Here I'm concerned specifically with phenomenal consciousness, the thing that's supposed to generate the hard problem of consciousness. So, what is the explanandum for a theory of phenomenal consciousness? Well, the traditional view is that it is qualia, understood as ineffable, intrinsic, essentially private properties of experience that are immediately apprehensible in consciousness. Here I'm quoting the definition that Daniel Dennett uses in his attack on qualia in his paper Quining Qualia. I'll call these properties classic qualia. Now, it's hard to see how classic qualia could be explained in physical terms. The standard routes for reductive explanation are through functional or representational analyses, and these just aren't available for intrinsic properties. So physicalists won't want to accept classic qualia as the explanandum for a theory of consciousness. The notion doesn't provide a neutral explanandum. Because of this, many philosophers adopt a watered-down conception of qualia, what I'll call diet qualia. This conception doesn't build in ineffability, intrinsicality, and privacy. The diet qualia of an experience are just the properties that constitute its subjective feel, its what it is likeness, where this may turn out to be something that's effable, relational, and private only in a very weak sense. People often say that although classic qualia may not exist, it's undeniable that diet qualia do. Now, this looks like the neutral explanandum we're after. Non-physicalists can go on to argue that the subjective feel of an experience is in fact an ineffable, intrinsic, private property which can vary independently of the experience's physical properties. And physicalists, for their part, can identify subjective feels with representational, functional, or neurological properties and explain away our intuitions about their ineffability, intrinsicality, and privacy, say by appealing to features of our phenomenal concepts. So, adopting diet qualia as the explanandum is a common move in the literature on consciousness. However, I'm suspicious of it. I'm just not convinced that there is any distinctive content to the notion of diet qualia. To make the point, let me introduce a third concept, which I shall call zero qualia. By zero qualia, I mean the properties of an experience that dispose us to judge that it has classic qualia, and to make the usual judgments about the character of those qualia. Now, I assume that diet qualia are supposed to be different from zero qualia. Zero qualia are defined in terms of their cognitive effects, not their feel. And an experience could have properties that dispose one to judge that it has classic qualia without it actually being like anything to undergo it. That's how it's supposed to be with philosophical zombies. As a parenthesis, note that it could turn out that the features that dispose us to judge that our experiences have classic qualia are in fact classic qualia themselves, assuming they're not epiphenomenal. Token zero qualia could be classic qualia. But that would be a contingent matter. There's nothing in the definition of zero qualia that requires it. There's nothing in the definition that requires that it's like anything to undergo an experience with zero qualia. So, an experience could have zero qualia without diet qualia. But what exactly would be missing? Well, a subjective feel, a what it is likeness. But what is that supposed to be, if not something intrinsic, ineffable, and private? This brings us to the crux of the matter. I can see how the properties that dispose us to judge that our experiences have subjective feels might not be ineffable, intrinsic, and private. But I find it much harder to see how a subjective feel itself might not be. What could a subjective feel be, if not a classic qualia? I understand what classic qualia are, and I understand what zero qualia are, but I don't understand what diet qualia are. I suspect the concept has no distinctive content. Okay, so I'm suggesting that the concept of diet qualia is vacuous. I'll now go on to defend that claim by looking at some suggestions as to how the concept might be fleshed out. In each case, I'll argue that the attempt either inflates the concept of diet qualia into that of classic qualia, deflates it into that of zero qualia, or fails to provide a neutral explanandum. Okay, first suggestion. It's intuitively obvious what diet qualia are. They're the properties in virtue of which our experiences are phenomenally conscious, and we have immediate first-person knowledge of what phenomenal consciousness is. If you got to ask, you ain't never going to get to know, as Louis Armstrong, or Fats Waller, or whoever it was, said about jazz. My reply here is that this suggestion tends to inflate the concept of diet qualia. If we have an immediate subjective knowledge of diet qualia, and if this is all we can say about them, then they seem indistinguishable from classic qualia. They're features of experience that are ineffable, private, and immediately apprehensible in consciousness. Put it another way, if diet qualia are not ineffable, private, and so on, then why are we forced to resort to hand-waving of this kind when we're asked about them? So I think this is an unhelpful suggestion. I think it just inflates the concept of diet qualia back into that of classic qualia. If the notion of diet qualia is to be of any use to us, then it needs to be given some more substantive content. Okay, suggestion 2. Diet qualia are introspectable properties of experience that seem to be intrinsic, ineffable, and private, but may not really be so. So this suggestion spells out the notion of diet qualia by specifying how they appear to us in introspection. My reply is that if the idea is that diet qualia are properties that dispose us to judge that they are intrinsic, ineffable, and private, then they're better classified as zero qualia. They are properties that dispose us to judge that the experiences that possess them have classic qualia, in this case by disposing us to judge that they themselves are classic qualia. Now, if the idea is that diet qualia have some further subjective aspect, some extra dimension of seeming beyond this disposition to judge, then I just return to my question. What is this subjective aspect, if not the one that's distinctive of classic qualia? Put it another way. If an experience seems to have classic qualia, and if this doesn't simply mean that it disposes us to judge that it has classic qualia, then how can it lack classic qualia? How can there be an is-seems distinction in such a case? Suggestion 3. Diet qualia are those properties of experience to which our phenomenal concepts refer, whatever these may happen to be. So this suggestion identifies diet qualia indirectly by reference to the conceptual capacities they trigger. Now, this, it seems to me, is a deflationary suggestion. If phenomenal concepts refer to the properties to which they are normally causally sensitive, then they'll refer to zero qualia. After all, zero qualia are defined as the properties that dispose us to apply phenomenal concepts, qualia concepts, to our experiences. Now, it could be that phenomenal concepts do in fact refer to classic qualia. As I said earlier, token zero qualia could be classic qualia. But this will be a contingent matter. And the description, the properties to which phenomenal concepts refer, wouldn't serve as a neutral explanandum for a theory of phenomenal consciousness. Non-physicalists may allow that it's an open question whether subjective fields are ineffable, intrinsic, and private, but they're not going to allow that it's an open question whether they are fields at all. Okay, so I don't think this suggestion works. Suggestion 4. Diet qualia are properties of experience for which we can possess introspective recognitional concepts. This is a suggestion I've taken from Peter Carruthers in his book Phenomenal Consciousness. I'll quote what he says. Phenomenally conscious events are ones which we can recognize in ourselves non-inferentially or straight off, in virtue of the ways in which they feel to us, or the ways in which they present themselves to us subjectively. So this is a variant of the previous suggestion, which identifies diet qualia indirectly by reference to the conceptual capacities associated with them. Now, there are two ways of interpreting this suggestion. If the idea is that diet qualia are just those features of experience that trigger the application of introspective recognitional concepts, or that can trigger the application of such concepts, then the suggestion is a deflationary one, for exactly the same reason the previous suggestion was. If diet qualia are simply the properties that dispose us to make classic qualia judgments, then they're identical with zero qualia. On the other hand, if the idea is that diet qualia are properties that trigger recognitional capacities specifically for subjective fields, then the suggestion depends on an unexplicated notion of subjective feel. What are these fields we recognize, if not classic qualia? So on this reading, the suggestion is inflationary. So whichever reading we take, this recognitional concept suggestion doesn't give a distinctive content to the notion of diet qualia. Okay, one more suggestion, suggestion 5. Diet qualia are what is given or presented to the subject in experience. Well, the problem here is that the notion of the given is itself in need of explication. One way to understand it is in terms of non-conceptual intentional content. What is presented to the subject, what is given to the subject, is a sort of raw perceptual data. Now, there may be worries about that notion, but let's assume that it does pick out something real that needs explaining. However, this notion can't serve as a neutral explanandum for a theory of phenomenal consciousness. If we identify diet qualia with some form of intentional content, then we just beg the question against believers in classic qualia who want to argue that subjective fields are intrinsic non-representational properties. So there may be a good explanandum here, but it's not the neutral one we're looking for. Okay, let me sum up, there's a pattern here. The suggestions we've considered either appeal to introspection, refer to cognitive effects, such as a tendency to trigger the application of phenomenal concepts, or they identify a phenomenon that's clearly distinct from classic qualia. And all fail because, well, the suggestions in the first class inflate the concept of diet qualia into that of classic qualia. The suggestions in the second class deflate it into that of zero qualia. And the suggestions in the third class don't pick out a neutral explanandum. And I strongly suspect that any further suggestions would fall into one of these three classes. Okay, moving on now. I've argued that the notion of diet qualia has no distinctive content. So if there are no classic qualia, then all that needs explaining, as far as the hard problem goes, is zero qualia. Now, that's not a popular view, but I think it's one that's tacitly reflected in the practice of philosophers who offer reductive accounts of consciousness. Typically, these accounts have three stages. First, diet qualia are introduced as a neutral explanandum. Second, diet qualia are identified with some natural property of experience, such as possession of a form of non-conceptual content or availability to higher order thinking. And third, this identification is defended by arguing that we would be disposed to judge that experiences with this natural property have ineffable intrinsic private fields. So in the end, diet qualia aren't explained at all, but simply identified with some other feature, and what actually gets explained are zero qualia. I call this the diet qualia, zero qualia shuffle. Now, in my paper, I illustrate this by looking at Peter Carruthers' account of phenomenal consciousness. I choose this because I think it's one of the most sophisticated and plausible. Now, I won't go through this this discussion in detail here, but I'll give the headline story. So, Carruthers proposes a form of dispositionalist higher order thought theory, HOT theory. The idea is that experiences become phenomenally conscious through becoming available to a theory of mind faculty, specifically to a theory of mind faculty which can understand the is-seems distinction and which can deploy recognitional concepts of experience. And Carruthers argues that if our experiences are available to such a theory of mind faculty, then we'll tend to judge that they possess a subjective dimension. He says in the quote here, "The presence of the hot consumer system renders the subject capable of thoughts of the form, this has a distinctive seeming distinct from the seeming of that," or "this experience is distinct from that." That's from his 2000 book, Phenomenal Consciousness. Moreover, he claims that such experiences will actually possess a subjective dimension. The idea is that availability to the hot system confers dual content on experiences. They represent both states of the world and themselves as experiencers of those states. For example, both red and experience of red. And in virtue of this dual content, Carruthers argues, the experiences will have a subjective feel. Here's what he says. Each phenomenally conscious experience has its distinctive form of subjectivity by virtue of acquiring a higher order analog content which precisely mirrors and represents as subjective its first order content. Okay, but it seems to me there is no real explanation of subjective feel here. Subjective feel is just identified with possession of dual content. Why should having dual content confer a subjective feel? If the claim seems plausible, I think it's because of the link between possession of dual content and dispositions to entertain thoughts about the subjectivity of experience of the kind Carruthers mentions in the first quotation. The account's persuasiveness comes from its ability to explain our disposition to judge that our experiences have a subjective dimension. That is from explaining zero qualia rather than dyad qualia. So here I think Carruthers is doing the dyad qualia, zero qualia shuffle. I want to stress that I don't regard that as a fatal weakness in Carruthers' theory. I think he does a good job of explaining what needs to be explained if we reject classic qualia realism. My complaint is that the account is missold as a theory of dyad qualia. I want to stress too that my complaint is not specific to Carruthers' account. That's just an illustration. The point generalizes. There can be no substantial explanation of dyad qualia, not just because there's an explanatory gap, but because the concept of dyad qualia has no distinctive content at all. So, in short, if we reject classic qualia realism, then all our intuitions about qualia need to be explained away, including the intuition that our experiences have a subjective feel at all. The final slide now, and some morals from this discussion. If what I've said is right, then the fundamental dispute about consciousness should be over the nature of the explanandum, not the explanans. The notion of dyad qualia just confuses the issue by leading us to think that both sides can agree about what needs to be explained, and that the core dispute is about whether the explanation can be a reductive one. If I'm right, then the fundamental choice point comes right at the start in the choice of explanandum, classic qualia or zero qualia. Classic qualia may demand a non-reductive approach, but zero qualia present no special problem for reductive explanation. So what I'm proposing is a divisive strategy. We can either affirm the existence of classic qualia or deny the existence of subjective feels altogether. For what it's worth, my own choice is for the second option, for irrealism, but I don't think that anything I've said turns on that. So, it's Chalmers or Dennett. There's no middle ground. And since people's choices here are likely to be determined by fundamental metaphysical and epistemological commitments, it may be that engagement between the two sides becomes pretty much impossible. That's a depressing prospect, but I think it's better to face up to it than to foster an illusion of consensus. Okay, so when it comes to qualia, if you want the real thing, opt for the classic formula or the zero formula. Have no truck with dyad qualia. Thank you very much.